We're continuing our discussion of Aquinas on law. And the next question, question 92, concerns the effects of law. First of all, the question is whether it is an effect of law to make men good. The answer to this question is yes. And this should seem obvious to an Aristotelian, and Aquinas will, in fact, side with him on this point. However, Aquinas also raises and answers interesting objections to the notion that the law can make men good. And these will resonate with modern people, I think. In Aristotle, you'll recall, men are made good by acquiring the virtues. And this is done through habituation. And good habits depend in part on good customs, which depend in turn on good laws. Aquinas is, of course, influenced by Aristotelian doctrine on this point, but he synthesizes it with Christian doctrine. So, in addition to the classical cardinal virtues, wisdom, justice, temperance, and courage, he must find a place for the so-called theological virtues, the higher virtues of faith, hope, and love that one finds in Christianity. The theological virtues, on Aquinas' view, are infused. They are infused. They are poured into us directly from God. And so thus, we see the first objection states, it seems that it is not an effect of law to make men good, for men are good through virtue, since virtue, as stated in the Ethics, that which makes its subject good. Virtue is that which makes its subject good. But virtue is in man from God alone, because it is he who works it in us without us. As we stated above in giving the definition of virtue, therefore law does not make men good. So that's one problem, one issue for someone who would, from a Christian perspective, hold the view that it's effective law to make men good, which is this theological position that actually, at least the highest virtues, faith, hope, and love, are gifts of God, free gifts of God's grace that are infused in us, and therefore are not things that law can engineer, so to speak. Objection 2 raises an issue from a more secular perspective. So let's look at that. Objection 2 says, further, law does not profit a man unless he obeys it. But the very fact that a man obeys a law is due to his being good. Therefore, in man, goodness is presupposed to the law. Therefore, the law does not make men good. In other words, it seems like there's a structural paradox in the very notion of being made good through law, because we have to ask, who is it who obeys the law? Who are these people who obey the law? And the answer seems obvious. Well, it's the good people. The good people are the ones who obey the law. The bad people don't obey the law. So if the bad people are just ignoring the law, how is it possible for the law to make these people good? Excuse me. How is it possible for the law to make these people good? It seems like the law has no effect on them. It doesn't do anything to them because they don't obey it. It's only the good people who obey the law, but the good people don't need to be made good. Good people are already good. So that's the reason they obey the law. So how can the law be making them good? They're already good. So that's kind of the structural paradox. It seems like the law is useless to make the good people good because they're already good, and it's useless to make the bad people good because the bad people just ignore it. So that's the second objection, which is one I think that we can still resonate with to some degree today. But objection 3 is liable to strike us as the most modern one. Objection 3 states, further, law is ordained to the common good as stated above, but some behave well in things regarding the community, who behave ill in things regarding themselves. Therefore, it is not the business of the law to make men good. So this is a wider scope than it seems. I think here we might view the general point behind this objection as follows: that it's not the business of the law to make men good, that virtue is a private matter, whether for good or for ill. That he suggests here someone who, maybe is obeying the law but is neglecting their private care of the soul, as Socrates might say, as Socrates says in the Republic, or not the Republic, but in the Apology, that it's our duty to care for our souls. But that seems like a private thing. It's not something that the laws of the city do. So this, going along with this, we might say, well, virtue is a private matter. It's not the government's business to make you virtuous, either pro or con. You might be a person who's a good citizen, so to speak, and being law-abiding, but in your private life, you're, someone who abuses your spouse or children or something like that. Of course, I guess that would be against the law. But, you might be that you have all kinds of vicious behaviors that aren't illegal from the public perspective, but that are nonetheless contributing to your badness as a private individual. So the idea is just being law-abiding is one thing, being virtuous is quite another. And finally, the fourth objection here makes the point that not every law is necessarily good promoting, yet it is no less a law for all that. So it says, further, some laws are tyrannical, as the philosopher says, but a tyrant does not intend the good of his subjects, but considers only his own profit. Therefore, the law does not make men good. So, as stated, Aquinas is going to say that, in fact, the law does make men good, that is one of the characteristic effects of law is to make men good. How does he answer these objections? Aquinas answers these objections by asserting that, quote, law is nothing other than a dictate of reason in the ruler by whom his subjects are governed. And the virtue of any subordinate thing consists in its being well subordinated by that by which it is regulated. So, for example, the irascible and concupiscible faculties, that is, our capacities for anger, lust, drunkenness, overeating, jealousy, and so forth. That's what he's talking about here, the irascible and concupiscible faculties. These are made virtuous by being subordinate to the faculties that properly rule over them, namely reason and the will obeying reason. So if you're a person who's got a temper, prone to over drinking or overeating or jealousy, jealous gossip of other people or whatever, how do you make yourself virtuous? Well, you make these tendencies subordinate to what properly rules over them, namely reason and the will obeying reason. And so an analogy with this, he's going to say that the whole individual is made virtuous by being subordinated to the legitimate governmental authority that rules over it. Aquinas seems to be arguing, through this analogy, the inner life of man, that being a law-abiding citizen itself makes one good. Of course, it's best if the laws themselves are in accord with the standard of divine justice. But even if they're not, there's still a good to be had. And the answer, he says, let's see, this is towards the end, like the last 4 or 5 lines there, depending on how you have your browser, where it says, if, however, the intention of the lawgiver. You take a second to find that. That's what I'll be reading from. If, however, the intention of the lawgiver is fixed on that which is not simply good, but useful or pleasurable to himself or in opposition to divine justice, then the law does not make men good simply, but in respect to that particular government. In this way, good is found even in things that are bad of themselves. Thus, a man is called a good robber because he works in a way that is adapted to his end. So the perspective seems to be that it's inherently good to become a law-abiding person, a person who obeys the laws of your city, state, and local governments, as we would say in the modern era, because that has a kind of effect on your character. It makes you a law-abiding person, regardless, it seems like, of the content of the law. Just having that kind of respect for authority is in itself a good thing. And perhaps we can see, even in the case of ruling one's private passions, how developing the kind of discipline, self-discipline that's needed to obey the laws of the city, state, and local governments is going to have potentially an effect in self-discipline in the private realm as well. So how does this help him to answer the objections? Remember, the first objection was this notion that the theological virtues have to come directly from God, and so the law has nothing to do with it. In relation to this objection, he says, well, we need to distinguish between acquired and infused virtues. And there are virtues that are purely acquired virtues. This basically corresponds to the virtues that Aristotle was considering, which he considered to be acquired virtues that were acquired by custom or habituation. So those acquired virtues dispose one to receive the infused virtues. And they also help to preserve both. And law is responsible for the customs that do the accustoming, as Aristotle said. So this is not an extreme view then of like God's grace or the idea of the gift of faith. Aquinas doesn't take the view, of course it's possible for God to do anything, but in the typical case, it's not going to be the case that someone who has just let themselves completely go with respect to lawlessness, who's become a completely lawless person, a scofflaw of the first order, has allowed themselves to degenerate completely when it comes to the acquired virtues like temperance, for example. It's not going to be the case that a person like this is going to be very likely to be receptive to faith, hope, and love. Rather, it's the opposite. That someone who has disciplined themselves and become virtuous in let's say, a purely secular sense, if you will, is the one who is open to, or most open to, receiving these virtues. They're disposed to it. They're, as it were, favorably disposed towards virtue in general by the fact that they become accustomed to these acquired, living in the way that's consonant with these acquired virtues. And so they're able to receive the infused virtues as well. So you see that view. You see this as perhaps more of a Catholic view of the theological virtues than certain forms of grace-centered theology in the Protestant realm. The second objection was this paradox about the uselessness of the law because the good people don't need it and the bad people ignore it anyway, so it's not going to have any effect. And here we need to take into account the common sense conclusion that, well, even bad men who don't want to obey the law might do virtuous actions out of the fear of the law. Fear of punishment motivates bad people to obey the law. Fear of punishment is not a virtue, but it can be the beginning of virtue, just like fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. Fear of punishment is the beginning of virtue. So that's how he would argue that one. Or answer that objection, rather. Reply to objection 2. Objection 3 was this idea that virtue is a private matter, law-abiding is a public matter, and they don't overlap, they don't intersect. We can already begin to see how Aquinas would probably respond to this. What he says in his reply to the objection is that basically, it's the no man is an island idea from John Donne, if memory serves. Everyone's a part of the whole. It's impossible that one can really achieve stable virtue personally unless your good is proportionate to the common good. We saw many aspects of this in Aristotle as well, ways in which achieving virtue as an individual involves relating to others and relying on others and is conditioned by the surrounding community in various ways. So the idea is that it's impossible for you to be good in your own private realm untouched by and not touching the goodness of the state as a whole. In your own private Idaho, locked away from everyone else. You've got to be part of the larger thing in order to really achieve virtue. Someone might, of course, disagree with that and argue that you can be virtuous by being a hermit or a mountain man or something like that. But Aquinas takes a view that is, I think, pretty much in alignment with Aristotle on this point. And then objection 4, Aquinas asserts that a tyrannical law is in fact a perversion of law, and at the same time it is a law. He says, yet insofar as it is something in the nature of a law, it aims at its citizens being good. What does he mean? What does he have in mind here? Well, it seems the idea is probably that, again, this idea that it's just, there's something intrinsically good in being a law-abiding person, even if you're obeying the laws of a tyrannical state. It's good to have citizens respect the law, even if the law is bad. So, I mean, and this, during revolutionary times, often comes up as an issue. Which is worse? Is this the unjust law, the regime of unjust law worse? Or is, let's say, the overthrow of the government and the complete chaos and anarchy worse? I mean, which is going to do the most damage? And typically, but the revolutionary argument is, well, in the short term, it could be that, by upsetting the regime, things are going to be worse. But in the long run, it's better to have this revolution rather than live under the bad effects of the present regime, into the foreseeable future. So that kind of idea, I think, is what underwrites the idea that even a tyrannical law has something good about it and aims at the citizens' good in some sense, insofar as it aims to make them law-abiding and preserves a certain degree of order. So those are the respects in which one of the effects of the law is to make men good. Now, the second article here is whether the acts of law are suitably assigned or designated. And this article we can deal with rather briefly. It deals with the sort of pedantic distinctions for which scholasticism, which Aquinas represents, has become proverbial. The point he's making here is that there are 3 types of human acts. I don't think we need to write these down. It's pretty straightforward. So the 3 types of human acts are, there's virtuous acts, good acts, we might say, morally good acts. There's vicious acts, bad acts, morally evil acts. So those are the first 2 categories, virtuous and vicious. And then, of course, there's the third category in between, which is those that are morally neutral, those that are neither virtuous nor vicious. So, for example, an example of a virtuous act might be spending the afternoon mowing your lawn. Spend the afternoon mowing your lawn, taking care of your yard so it looks nice, doesn't become an eyesore to your neighbors. That's a virtuous act. A vicious act would be spending the afternoon vandalizing your neighbor's house while he's at the Lobos game. And an indifferent act would be attending the Lobos game, which is neither morally good nor bad. And corresponding to these 3 types of human action are 3 acts of law: commanding, prohibiting, and permitting. So law commands morally good acts. The law, or we tend to describe it as a city ordinance, demands that you mow your lawn or have somebody mow your lawn. You can't let your lawn grow 2 feet high or whatever. The law requires you to mow it to keep it neat and clean. So that's the command. So that's the first act of law, commanding. So law commands morally good acts. Of course, here is one of these areas where, especially from a modern perspective, we might think that law is a narrower sphere of command, that it doesn't command all morally good acts, that there are things that are morally good, things that you ought to do that are commanded by law. But here, remember, we're thinking about the general sense of law. So this would encompass not just, let's say, the human laws of the city, but also natural law, also, the eternal law. All of this is being discussed here. So commanding is one thing that law does, and that is what it does for morally good acts. It's the characteristic of law to command morally good acts. It's also the characteristic of law to do the converse and to prohibit morally bad acts or morally evil acts. So it commands morally good acts first. That's the first act of law, commanding, which is directed towards morally good acts. The second act of law is prohibiting, which is directed towards morally evil acts. And then there is permitting, the third act of law. And here, this is directed, of course, against morally neutral acts, or indifferent acts, as he calls them. And here you might think that this is not really an act of law. It's kind of like an omission or an absence of law. And you might think that if we hadn't, of course, just been through these lockdowns in which we're very familiar, we become very conscious of the way in which the state has been permitting things that we assumed, that we didn't think of as an act of the state to permit. For example, my third example, the example of the indifferent action, going to a Lobo game. You haven't been able to go to a Lobo game for the last year because the state hasn't permitted it. The law hasn't permitted it. So permitting is something that the law normally does as well. So those are the three acts: commanding, prohibiting, and permitting, which correspond to three types of human action. Human action as it pertains to morality, namely morally good acts, morally bad acts, and morally indifferent acts, or neutral acts. Okay, and then there's a fourth distinctive act of law, which is to punish. And this is what we might think of as what gives force to the law. And Aquinas seems to regard this as a kind of necessary, even intrinsic feature of law, that it does carry with it the threat of punishment. So you might say there is not really a law in place if it's optional, and if there's no punishment attached, then it's not. Then it is optional. It's not really an act that's actually commanded if there's no punishment attached to it. Also, and this is the point that he emphasizes more, that anyone may reward, but only law can punish. So, your neighbor notices you mowing your lawn to show his appreciation that you haven't mowed your lawn in 2 months or whatever. He brings you over a beer to thank you for mowing your lawn. Of course, you might regard this as kind of passive-aggressive. But anyway, let's suppose it's not. So he rewards you for mowing your lawn. But your neighbor can't punish you for not mowing your lawn. Right? Your neighbor, you're not going to open your mailbox and see a bill in there from your neighbor fining you for not mowing your lawn. It's not within the power of your neighbor to enforce the law. It's only the law that can punish. Now, the question of the nature of punishments is something he doesn't get into here. Presumably, there's going to be different types of punishment involved when we're dealing with the different types of law. But the idea is that punishment sort of belongs to the function of law. And this is entirely consonant with the function of law, which is to make men good. So Aquinas seems to be assuming here that punishment actually makes men good. It's not something that makes men worse. People might, of course, disagree with this. Especially if you're influenced by, various forms of propaganda from prison reformers and things like that. You might think that punishment actually tends to make people bad, makes people worse. Nietzsche also argued that punishment makes people worse, doesn't make people better. But that isn't the traditional idea. The traditional idea is that punishment is supposed to make people better. And of course, we began with the fear of punishment itself, which is, as we just said, is the beginning incentive for bad people to perform virtuous actions and maybe hold out a hope that they will eventually become virtuous and give up their evil ways. Okay. So this leads to our first discussion question. We're covering up the brand here. That's why I'm doing this. Not that I need to hold two hands, but no one paid me for my endorsement, so I'm not going to show the brand of my soda. Anyway, first discussion question. Is the Thomistic Aristotelian view that the purpose of the law is to make people good the correct one? Is this notion of law plausible any longer in the modern age? Is this role of law in people's lives an undue infringement upon their autonomy and right to self-determination? Why or why not? So once again, first discussion question. Is the Thomistic Aristotelian view that the purpose of the law is to make people good the correct one? Is this notion of law plausible any longer in the modern age? Is this role of law in people's lives an undue infringement upon their autonomy and right to self-determination? Why or why not? Okay, So now we're up to the first of his more detailed accounts of the various types of law that we gave a broad overview of last time. You'll recall that these were the eternal law, the natural law, the human law, and the divine law. So first we consider here the eternal law, which will be the second and final topic for this video. So here in question 93, he begins in Article 1 with the question, whether the eternal law is a sovereign type ratio existing in God. What is the sovereign type? So basically just think here, is it the supreme plan? The sovereign type is like the blueprint. You're going to remember this if you think of the word type. Think of like a prototype. What's a prototype? It's sort of the first instance of a product that's to be mass produced, and it's meant to serve as a kind of model for the rest. Well, here we're not talking so much about prototypes, but of archetypes. The archetype, which is the original model or template. And there's a kinship here between Aquinas' notion of the eternal law and the Platonic heaven of the forms. We can think of the eternal law for Aquinas as something like the archetypes for all of reality. This comes out if you read his answer. So I'm going to read this in full. Answer to Article 1 of question 93, which I need to queue up here. I answer that, just as in every artificer, there pre-exists a type of the things that are made by his art. So that would correspond to the prototype that I was mentioning here. So too in every governor, there must pre-exist the type of the order of those things that are to be done by those who are subject to his government. And just as the type of the things yet to be made by an art is called the art or exemplar of the products of that art, so too the type in him who governs the acts of his subjects bears the character of a law, provided the other conditions be present which we have mentioned above. That is, the other conditions of law. Remember that it's made by competent authority, that it's for the general good, and that it's promulgated. Now God, by his wisdom, is the creator of all things, in relation to which he stands as the artificer to the products of his art. And this is an important phrase. This is you might say, the making explicit of what one could regard as sort of implicit in the understanding of being that you have in Plato and Aristotle, when you have this idea of there being final causes for things. That is, things are as if they were designed by an artificer for a purpose. And here Aquinas would say, well, there's no as if about it. In fact, they are designed by an artificer for a purpose, namely God. God stands as the artificer to the products of his art. What is the products of his art? All of creation. And therefore, just as a human artificer has a type of things in his mind, a prototype, you might say, or the archetype of what he wants to create in his mind before he creates it, so too God governs all the acts and movements in every single one of his creatures according to the type of the divine wisdom, as he calls it here. Inasmuch as by the type of the divine wisdom, by the archetype in the divine wisdom, all things are created, has the character of art, exemplar, or idea. So the type of the divine wisdom, as moving all things to their due end, bears the character of law. Accordingly, the eternal law is nothing else than the type of the divine wisdom as directing all actions and movements. So it's not just that God has ideas of things in its mind, but rather these ideas serve, as I've already suggested, as a kind of blueprint. That is, they guide the creation, or more exactly, they guide the activities and actions of the creation through the volition and power of God that makes it so. Okay, so it's if we imagine something like Plato's heaven as having the characteristic of a blueprint that serves as the type, as the archetype or the prototype for all of the individual types of things in creation. What we get is the creation as having the character of having certain essential properties, being directed towards certain final ends. All of that sort of flows from the eternal law. The question is raised as to how the eternal law is promulgated as one of the objections. And this is interesting. In reply to objection 2, he says, this is addressing the question of, if the eternal law is really a law, it's got to be more than just the measure and standard by which things in the creation behave, because a law has to be promulgated. That's one of the conditions of law that Aquinas has already laid out. So how does that work? How is that supposed to be the case? And so he says, well, there has to be a word that in which this law is expressed. And the eternal law is expressed by the Word, which is of course, this corresponds to the second person of the Trinity associated with Jesus biblically. He says, with regard to any sort of word, 2 points may be considered, namely the word itself and that which is expressed by the word. For the spoken word is something uttered by the mouth of man and expresses that which is signified by the human word. So the first point he makes is there's no real word if you just have, let's say, sounds or marks on some medium that can, hold, marks that would signify letters. That you've got to have some idea attached to them. There has to be something that's signified by these marks or signified by these sounds. The same applies to the human mental word, which is nothing else than something conceived by the mind by which man expresses thoughts mentally. So there's got to be a thought ultimately underlying this, and that's the true word. So then in God, the word conceived by the intellect of the Father is the name of a person. But all things that are in the Father's knowledge, whether they refer to the essence or the persons or the works of God, are expressed by this word. And among other things expressed by this word, the eternal law is expressed thereby. Nor does it follow that the eternal law is a personal name in God, yet it is appropriated to the Son on the account of the kinship between type and word. So this is a difficult passage. But what he seems to be saying is that the eternal law is expressed in Jesus. The Son is the expression of the eternal law. Now, how exactly this relates to this question of, our partaking of the eternal law through the natural law and so on. But anyway, this is kind of mystical theology that we're dealing with here. But that seems to be the idea, that there is a promulgation of the eternal law, and it's in the Word of God. And the Word of God is associated theologically with the second person of the Trinity, namely Jesus. Article 2, whether the eternal law is known to all. The answer to this question is that it is known indirectly and in part. I answer that a thing may be known in 2 ways. First, in itself, and second, in its effect, wherein some likeness of that thing is found. Thus, someone not seeing the sun in its substance may know it by its rays. So then no one can know the eternal law as it is in itself, except the blessed who see God in his essence. But every rational creature knows it in its reflection, greater or less, for every knowledge of truth is a kind of reflection and participation of the eternal law, which is the unchangeable truth, as Augustine says. Now all men know the truth to a certain extent, at least to the common principles of the natural law. And as to the others, they partake of the knowledge of truth, some more, some less, and in this respect are more or less cognizant of the eternal law. So we can't know the mind of God totally and completely. but we can know the truth to a certain extent. And so the short answer is that the eternal law isn't totally known by all. It's known most by those who are among the blessed, those who enjoy the vision of God, which is the ultimate end of humanity that we talked about previously. It's known to a lesser extent, presumably, by those who are still living but are righteous and have received the revelation of Christ and so forth, and have appreciated God's providence and plan for salvation and history as it's recorded in the Bible and all that. And then, of course, it's known most commonly, even by people who are non-Christians who have never heard of Christianity, by virtue of the fact that they partake of the natural law. They know the eternal law insofar as that's reflected in the natural law. So we can't know the mind of God totally and completely, but we can know the truth to a certain extent. And mostly, for the most part, what we can know of the eternal law is the natural law. But it might also include things like the aspects of revealed truth. Article 3, whether every law is derived from the eternal law. Now, if the eternal law is roughly God's sovereign governing plan or blueprint for creation, it would seem that all laws ultimately derive from it. And that is Aquinas' view here. God is the supreme cause of all lawgiving, and so all subordinate lawgiving is ultimately derived from God's lawgiving. One puzzle, however, arises in connection with the law of concupiscence. So concupiscence, recall, this is basically refers to the human tendency to sin, what's known in Christian theology as our fallen nature, our proneness to sin, our inclinations to evil. That is the result of Adam's fall and so forth. So the objection that arises here is this. So this is objection 1. And this is essentially a version of the problem of evil that you might be familiar with from philosophy of religion. He says, objection 1, it would seem that not every law is derived from the eternal law, for there is a law of the fomes, as stated above. Remember that this is the decayed matter. This is the way this translation renders this idea of the law of concupiscence. So there's this law of concupiscence, which is not derived from that divine law, which is the eternal law, since thereunto pertains the prudence of the flesh, in which the apostle says it cannot be subject to the law of God. Therefore, not every law is derived from the eternal law. I mean, a clearer way of stating the problem here is just, if there is such a thing as this law of concupiscence, this tendency towards sinfulness, and this is a kind of law of human nature in its fallen state, this can't be derived from God, right? Because sin can't be derived from God. So it would seem then that not all law can be derived from God. And Aquinas replies here that the law of sin in man is actually a consequence of divine justice. That is, if we ask, well, why is man subject to this law of the fomes, the decayed matter of sin? So you think of like that fomes, the images. Imagine you did something wrong, and as a result, you injured yourself. Like let's say you're a bank robber and you were trying to escape from the police and you got into a car wreck and your vehicle burst into flames, and as a consequence, you have all these horrible burn scars. That would be like the fomes of evil. This is like the scar our human nature bears due to the sin of Adam. That's the idea. And so Aquinas is going to say, well, this is derived from the eternal law in an indirect way. Not directly. It's not as God wanted that to be the case, but rather it's as a consequence of divine justice. So it is derived from the law in that indirect way, that it's a consequence of the divine justice. A second related problem concerns whether unjust laws can be derived from the eternal law. Seems to be sort of related, but it's a distinct problem. He says in objection 2, so here's another objection someone could raise, Further, nothing unjust can be derived from the eternal law, because, as stated above, the eternal law is that according to which it is right that all things should be most orderly. But some laws are unjust, according to Isaiah 10:1. Woe to them that make wicked laws. Therefore, not every law is derived from the eternal law. So, what's the status of these unjust laws? How can they be derived from the eternal law? And he replies to this that human law has the nature of law insofar as it partakes of right reason, and it is clear that in this respect it is derived from the eternal law. But insofar as it deviates from reason, it is called an unjust law and has the nature not of law but of violence. So that's an important point. And he says an unjust law is not something that bears the character of law anymore, but rather has the character of violence. So there's something extra legal about an unjust law. He acknowledges that here. Nevertheless, even an unjust law, insofar as it retains some appearance of law, though being framed by one who is in power, is derived from the eternal law, since all power is from the Lord God, according to Romans. So the idea here seems to be that an unjust law, even though in a certain way it really has renounced its status as law and become a form of violence, still at least has a kind of form of law that it derives from the true thing, right? So it's like a person who is acting as a kind of pseudo version of something. That person is going to depend upon the real thing and the existence of the real thing for their effectiveness, like a decoy, any kind of a decoy. I mean, if you're going duck hunting or something like that, you put out a decoy. Well, if there weren't any, let's say you're putting in a decoy duck or something like that. If there weren't any ducks that looked like that, of course, first of all, you wouldn't be hunting ducks. But leaving that to one side, you wouldn't be effective as a decoy. You're parasitic in a certain sense on the real thing. And that's a general point about anything it's kind of a pseudo version of something that's real. And that's the character of an unjust law. It's kind of a pseudo version of a real law. And so that's the sense in which it is also derived from the eternal law, because the eternal law is the source of all law. And even unjust laws are sort of mimicking or imitating outwardly the real thing. I think we think especially here of the laws of Nazi Germany. It was a very legalistic society, was concerned to preserve a kind of legal veneer. And so, even when they would have summary executions, often, I guess it would be summary in that case, but sometimes there would be, individuals who would be executed on trumped up charges, and they would put them through some kind of sham trial. With sham judges who are Nazi ideologues, yelling at them or whatever, in order to create the veneer of law. But that's parasitic on there being a real deal. And so ultimately, in that indirect sense, it's also derived from eternal law. So that's what he wants to say. And this leads us to the second discussion question. Does it make sense to you that man's sinful nature and bad laws could be derived from God's eternal law? Is this consistent with the perfection of God? Why or why not? So once again, second discussion question. Does it make sense to you that man's sinful nature and bad laws could be derived from God's eternal law? Is this consistent with the perfection of God? Why or why not? And so this question that I just asked is, of course, a kind of version of the problem of evil as it arises in relation to this kind of theologically based ethic. So see what you think about that. Okay, Article 4. Whether necessary and eternal things are subject to the eternal law. Are necessary and eternal things subject to the eternal law? And the answer is no. Necessary and eternal things are not subject to the eternal law. Why? Well, because law implies restraint, and necessary and eternal things need no restraint. And Aquinas explains this by analogy to human government. So, human laws apply only to what can be restrained by human beings. they do not concern what is naturally necessary for human beings. That is, there are no laws against teleporting or no laws against walking through walls, at least not yet. Maybe sometime in the future we'll have, anti-mutant laws or whatever, like on X-Men, that will prohibit those sorts of things. But it makes no point, and there's no point in having laws against things that are impossible for us to do anyway, right? Or you can view it in the opposite direction. You can say that there's no laws that are needed to enforce what's necessary for us. Namely, that we can only move from point A to point B through local motion. That we can only get from one side of the wall to the other side of the wall by as it were, clearing out the material in between us and the other side, and so forth. So these things are necessary for us, given our nature and given the nature of the world. And so we don't need to have laws to prescribe them. And so by analogy, we shouldn't expect that eternal law applies to God's nature. Since God's nature, on Aquinas' view, this pertains, of course, to his general theology, which is another part of the Summa Theologiae. So it's not completely filled in here, but presumably the idea is at least roughly familiar, culturally familiar, for no other reason, that God's nature is necessary. God is what God is by necessity. And so there's no need to apply eternal law to God any more than there's a need to, legislate to us that, we can't teleport or whatever. Because it belongs to our nature, it belongs to God's nature to be that way. So God is not subject to law. God doesn't apply law to himself. God is not autonomous, to use a modern term, applying laws to himself. God is the source of laws, but is not under law. But that is in no way taken to imply that God's laws are in any way arbitrary, because God's nature is necessary. And so it wouldn't be possible for God to legislate in ways other than he does. Article 5, whether natural contingent natural things are subject to the eternal law. So contingent natural things, which is, basically what we think of as the universe, in contrast with the divine nature, are subject to the eternal law. God imprints the whole of nature with the principles of its proper actions, its essences and its proper ends. All of these exist because God imprints them onto things in creating them. What distinguishes human beings, as I've said before, is that we can know and will these principles. Irrational creatures merely obey them. All creation acts according to law. All creation acts according to its essence, according to its natural ends and seeking its natural goodness. But a human being can act according to his idea of a law, his idea of these things, and not just in conformity with what its nature is. One interesting objection here under Article 4 is number 3. Oops. Sorry. This is Article 5, rather. Sorry. That's. Which is the idea that the eternal law is most efficient, but in natural contingents, defects occur. The eternal law is most efficient. That's just to mean it's most, efficacious. It should be perfectly efficacious, right? The eternal law. In other words, God's blueprint should be completely instantiated in his creation. But in natural contingents, defects occur. Therefore, they are not subject to the natural law. So the idea here is, the suggestion is, does the existence of defects or apparent defects in creation point to a gap in the eternal law, a way in which the eternal law is not efficacious, in which it does not come into effect? And the reply says this: although the defects which occur in natural things are outside the order of particular causes, they are not outside the order of universal causes, especially of the first cause, i.e. God, from whose providence nothing can escape. and hence the eternal law is the type of divine providence as stated above. Hence the defects of natural things are subject to the eternal law. So he's making this distinction here between particular causes and universal causes. So the particular causes are sort of the way things go normally in the normal course of nature. You know, when we say a dog has 4 legs, part of what we're basing that on is that we observe in nature that typically when puppies are born, they have 4 legs. But of course, occasionally, you know, a puppy will be born with a birth defect, maybe it only has 3 legs. In that case, you would say it's outside the order of particular causes, but it's not outside the order of universal causes, especially the first cause. So in the case of the puppy born with a birth defect, there's a reason it's born with a birth defect. It's, you know, there still are laws of nature that explain why that happened. From a human perspective, we could even sometimes perhaps say that from the absolute perspective, even things that we regard as a defect is part of the plan. Nothing really escapes God's providence. And so, you know, we might puzzle over instances of, again, we're back to evil here, you know, things that we regard as being outside of the natural law. How is this allowed? The Holocaust and these horrible evils. But the idea here is that from the perspective of the most universal causes, this isn't really an exception to the eternal law. Article 6, whether all human affairs are subject to the eternal law. This is the last article. Are all human affairs subject to the eternal law? Yes, and in 2 ways. Or we might say yes, but in 2 ways. So they're subject to the eternal law through our reason, which is the distinctively human way. When, you know, we recognize the natural law, which is, of course, the aspect of the eternal law that our reason can discern, and then we follow it. We cooperate with what our reason tells us we should do, which we would do naturally if our intellect perceives the truth. Our will naturally will pursue that. In Aquinas' view, that is, if we perceive the true good, since our will longs for the good, we will pursue that our intellect truly discerns about the good. But sometimes, of course, that doesn't happen, and we are led astray in our perception of the good. But we're still subject to the eternal law, although now through our animal actions and passions, as in the same way that the irrational animals are. So, and passions here doesn't mean like we use it like our strong emotion. It doesn't mean that here. It means our sufferings, our being passive. So one aspect of this is that since the natural law for us is also the way in which we come to know what's naturally good for us, if, that is to say, you know, we are mistaken about that, we will end up suffering. If we end up pursuing things that are not actually good for us because we have a mistaken impression of what the natural law says, or we, you know, rebelliously reject it for some reason, we are going to nonetheless be subject to that law, but now we're subject to it not as an active agent who is advancing towards the good, but now as a passive patient, if you will, a sufferer who suffers the bad consequences of our transgressions. So in this suffering, it's sort of analogous to karma, but this is the Christian version. The balance in the universe, so to speak, is restored. And this restores the perfect compliance with the eternal law. When we suffer the consequences. And then in a sense that then just validates the law, of course. And this, of course, also relates to earlier remarks about punishment, the way in which punishment is a kind of inherent feature of the law itself, because it's through punishment that we come to feel the force of law. And when we're punished for ignoring the natural law, that is in a sense just a sign of the validity of the natural law, and it's the fact that it is in force. That if you violate it, you suffer. Just like, of course, if you violate what we think of as laws of nature in the more modern sense, you know, if you flout the law of gravity, you will suffer. If you decide I'm going to ignore gravity, like Wile E. Coyote in the Roadrunner cartoons, you know, you suffer the consequences. And it's the same kind of idea here. Okay, so I think that covers the eternal law. So next time we'll go on to the next type of law, which is the central case for ethical theory, which is natural law.